What are the odds? What's going to happen? Because you said the future has never been more predictable, and I hear you, and it scares me when I listen to you. But then I see you smile and feel like maybe you know something I don't.
Just to put some numbers out there, we use UN data sets because they are the most accepted one around the world, and they're probably conservative in terms of capturing the whole consumption, and they're probably over-optimistic in terms of regeneration of the planet, because the FAO is very kind of production oriented. So probably the gap that we see between human demand and regeneration is much larger. And we focus on regeneration because we see regeneration as the bottleneck for humanity, much more so than, for example, fossil fuels. I mean, the fossil fuels are also much more limited by regeneration, not by much how much is on the ground, but by how much we can burn without destroying the biosphere. So that's kind of becoming the limiting factor. So when you look at regeneration and the balance, we come to the conclusion, and as I said, I think it's conservative, and we have done it for a number of years, and we come to a similar conclusion, that at least in the current year, demand exceeds what Earth can regenerate by 75%. So it's like using 1.75 Earth. At the same time, if you want to maintain biodiversity, or just 85% of biodiversity, ecologists say we may need to put aside, or we may need only to use half the capacity of the planet. So half would be a goal. We're globally at 1.75. That's a huge gap. And what is most stunning is that the market is not seeing it. So if the market doesn't see it, the prices don't reflect that incredible gap. Overshoot will still come to an end, but by shock, not by kind of soft landing, you know. So we are not seeing that gap well enough. Now, that can become overwhelming, as you say, oh my God, we can't do anything. And I want to just tell a little story, personal experience, because it's about how do we hold that story as well. So I went on a little bicycle ride in California 2 weeks ago, or 3 weeks ago, I'm not sure. And suddenly the street was getting more narrow because we were passing a wetland or something. And so there were a few cars there, and the cars had to go slower because of me and the bicycle. There were about 5 cars. And the 5th car in the back was a muscle car. And if you know, the muscle car is very kind of sportsy car, like loud cars in the United States. And he opened the window and he shouted at me, how dare I kind of take the space or whatever. It's kind of horrible. And of course, my first reaction was, oh my God, how would I be able to kind of live on this planet with other people who just have no recognition of where we need to go? And like, if we cannot collaborate, it's like this, it's hopeless. What can we do? You know, it can get in this kind of frenzy. Oh my God, if they use kind of this other car. And then soon I kind of quickly reframed it of saying, actually, it's the other way around. Those who recognize the future and can make their lives more resource secure will be better prepared for that future. And what I should feel is compassion for that person who has invested his life into machines and properties and houses, whatever, that require incredible amounts of resources to operate. And he will be extremely exposed to those trends, and he will lose a lot of his assets because they are not fit for the future. So they, oh my God, this poor person is not prepared. It's not saying we don't have to agree, you know, but actually by recognizing it's about resource security, which is the same story, just the other end of the pipe. You know, it's not about climate change and oh my God, it's just getting warmer outside. No, what are the implications of climate change? Climate change will mean we'll have to move out of fossil fuels eventually. So that's no less input. If more climate change means less biological regeneration, that would be more difficult. So do you have a life that can operate on a far more narrow resource base and still work well? And then if you can, you're actually safer. So you don't have to wait for others. Actually, if the others don't act, it becomes even more important for yourself to be resource secure. So it's not like wait for the others. It's exactly the opposite. I'm very stunned why we don't see it that way more generally. I mean, the general conversation, the UN conversation is all about, oh my God, we have to first agree before we can act, simplify. That's very disempowering. Well, I think if you really think from a game theory perspective about the challenge we're in, it's the exact opposite. There's no benefit in waiting. So I'm not feeling constrained by others in that way. I feel actually more amplified, saying, wow, it makes even more sense to take sustainability on as a core strategy for my decisions. There's no downside to it. That's so I feel more secure by kind of making these choices accordingly. I'm not more depressed or more exposed because I think about these issues. On the contrary, I can be engaged with the most interesting question on this planet. That's wonderful. And also, personally, I think I make decisions around being less exposed. And Mario has already a great question. Or even
I invited Johan to the hot seat here,
Yeah.
and I'm going to ask for Marco later.
okay.
Yeah, actually, I don't know if it's a great question, but I guess so. So, Mathis, you mentioned a lot of different things we all know and all people on the world know, yeah? And at the end, if I discuss regarding sustainability with other people around me, at the end, it comes to the one and single point resolution that every one of us has to accept to live less convenient as we are doing right now. And it's about accepting that there is less convenience in the future necessary to solve that climate change goal. Would you agree on that and comment on that?
Mathematically, what you're saying is true, and psychologically, it will not invite people. So mathematically speaking, if a Martian comes down from Mars, looks at the planet, the Martian would come to two very clear conclusions. One is your metabolism is too high. You need to shrink as humanity. Clearly, if you want to have a future, you need to shrink. Second conclusion, some people clearly don't have enough even to thrive. And if you want to have lack of enough, if you don't have too many conflicts, you need to share. That means those who actually have privilege, they need to shrink doubly, shrinking to shrink and shrinking to share. That's the mathematical conclusion of the Martians. Now, on planet Earth, both these strategies are the most effective political suicide strategies. There's no system on this planet, communism, whatever, authoritarian, whatever, that can live off the promise to shrink and share and stay in place. That's kind of that's the underlying challenge. So how then do we address this challenge in a way that is inviting and positive? So it's like when you lose weight, people are not invited into losing weight by saying, hey, you're going to be miserable and hungry for the next month. People go, yeah, let me be hungry. Yeah, you have to kind of put the benefit before. And so kind of telling the story from just an opposite end is to say resource security. If you invest in your own resource security, you have a much higher chance to be better off in the future we can anticipate. You invest in yourself. This is not wasted money. You're not giving up yourself for the others. And be greedy about things that actually will be effective in the future. You know, when you look at German fairy tales, greed, how is that portrayed? Not as spending a lot, but by hoarding, by not spending, by being
It's the opposite.
It's the opposite in some way. And so I think that's so we can be greedy in being conservative. So it's not about because the outcome of well-being is so subjective. It's very hard to read the well-being from a material perspective, you know. I mean, just to take a very extreme example, if I had to free climb a big rock of 500 meters height, that would be the worst thing that could ever happen to me. I mean, I would be so scared. I wouldn't enjoy it at all. But there are other people, they spend their whole life doing it and they couldn't be more thrilled doing it. So I'm just saying that this extreme thing looks totally different for different people. And it's kind of, it's about your own choice. So if you say, I invest in my resource security and maybe from a physical perspective, your consumption will go down quite a bit, but you feel it's actually beneficial to your well-being. It's not a giving up. It's actually, you feel more wealthy. You feel more in control of your destiny. You feel better. So even though physically the same thing is happening, you're not doing it to sacrifice yourself for the commons and then feel resentful about your neighbor not doing the same thing. Which becomes, does that make sense, Mario?
Absolutely, and I'm sure it's not about sacrificing. It's about, I would say, thinking for the tomorrow, and not being only focused on the ownership of human being, but focusing on what's next, I would say.
I think that's that. And it's I mean, one unfortunate thing is, and I understand it, why, particularly in the climate sustainability debate, the word self-interest has a very negative connotation. Seen as selfish, uncooperative, brutal, whatever. Or while in the end, if you don't see yourself in it, and it actually you invest in yourself, that that's what I want, the transformational power is just too weak, generally.
Let's shift gears a little towards habits. Johan asked a good question. What would be the thing that we should cut first when we go? Let's look into the habits that we have to change.
I think the first thing to change, first habit to change, is to say have to and should and must. Because it becomes a manipulative mind frame. I see you as the problem and I want to control you. And since I cannot get rid of you, please consume half. Yeah, so it's not a strong invitation. Do you know what I mean? Are we? I think we probably discussed that also when we were in our house in Oakland. I think the most significant policy question is the following, and it's not taught at policy schools, unfortunately, is you need to ask yourself first, do you love people? Because that's kind of the foundation on which you build your policies. If you think the world will be better off without those people, all the ideas that come forward will be received as that of saying, like I would receive that message as saying, you think the world is better without me, not you want me with it in the transformation. And so psychologically it becomes conflictive. So I think to make it a bit more psychological even, if people feel a sense of scarcity, they often get fearful and more instinctively driven, and often don't come up with the best solutions overall. Yet the reality is we live in an extremely scarce world. How do we overcome this paradox? And I would say it's the following. There's a big distinction between a sense of psychological abundance and a sense of physical abundance. So the question is, how can we generate a sense of psychological abundance that opens people's hearts and minds and in the context of extreme physical scarcity? I think that's kind of the frame. And how does that work? Ideas are a sense of kind of, abundance. We open new doors and possibilities and ways of looking at world. And the sense we have, if you're well fed already, that's nice to be I'm well fed, overly fed probably, but the sense that comes from new ideas and community and learning more from each other produces it. I don't know what kind of hormones it produces, but it produces the same sense of abundance and openness and wanting to share and finding new things that we require, I think, to build this kind of transformation.
Elite, I invited you to the hot seat to ask your question.
Yes, thank you, Nikki, and thank you, Mathis, for sharing your view. And my question was, let's say I'm doing my baby step in this, in the way you cover the topic, to the point that I was doing some research on the side to understand what was Earth Overshoot Day.
Mm-hmm.
And my question is, when you mention invest in your own resource security, what does it mean? Does it mean I should be living with a garden with vegetables and with a forest to have some resources? What type of resources are you speaking about that I should be safe about? If you could develop, please.
Again, there's no should. It's up to you to choose what you want to do. I just believe in a world that is overstretched. If you're able to operate in a way that is far more resource secure, you're in a much better situation. That's what I mean. Now, what does it mean specifically? So I go just bring in, I may repeat myself, but I believe regeneration is the ultimate limiting factor. So that means, like, how much can Earth regenerate? Like a farm regenerates. How much do you use? Ultimately, solutions that are replicable, that means everybody in the world could do it. They lead to win-win potentials, because that solution is easier to multiply for yourself because there's some competition with others. And if others do it, it's also better for the whole. So true win-win solutions are solutions that are physically replicable, and investing in those actually makes it easier for you to win, and it makes it easier for others to win, and it makes it easier for everybody to win at the same time. Now that's still quite abstract. What does it mean in specific? I mean, I'm in Switzerland right now. Our demand, net demand, is 3 times. If everybody in the world lived like the Swiss do, it would take 3 Earths entirely. When we said half, maybe like useful. Switzerland has less biocapacity than the world as a whole. That means it would take 4.5 Switzerlands to support the Swiss. Everybody building cities and enterprises and countries, believing that there will always be more from somewhere else to feed that, puts themselves incredibly at risk. So now, what does that mean specifically? Let's start from investments. I think the best investments you can make is in companies that if you double them, global overshoot will go down, because they're already able to operate now. And they will easily be able to operate in that future, because they're actually even driving overshoot down. So if the world is better off with them, more of them, better planet. So invest in those companies, or build these companies. And so that's come from the income stream, or from your investment perspective. On your personal side as well, if you're able to live in a way that doesn't take much energy to heat or cool your house, so you don't have to fear kind of energy, like, oh my God, will we have gas in Europe next year, the winter? Will not be as scary. If you know how to eat, to prepare some more simple food, whatever, when you're not that exposed, you have much more choice. If your house is in a situation that doesn't require very complex transportation requirements, you get a much stronger position. If you don't depend on very complex wardrobes, for example. I mean, it goes into that just to say, you gain levels of freedoms in a world that is so tight that allow you to keep making choices you want to make. I don't know if that's specific enough, but it's okay.
Quentin, I put you on the hot seat. You raised your hand.
Well, I appreciate it. Ever since we met in April, Mathis, I've been thinking about the idea of how we measure things, and that's partly because I'm left brain and I like the data and evidence and things, but I think the engagement side, the right brain is just as important. This is right. So, but I wonder about how we measure these things. I like Earth Overshoot Day concept because it starts to measure productivity, effectiveness, efficiency. So, for example, the company you just mentioned that you ought to invest in, you could measure how is their comparable efficiency in terms of resources, people, not just people, but because we've had a lot of labor savings efforts over the last 50 years. So we now have these little vacuum cleaners that go around without us pushing it, but it's using probably at least as much. Hopefully it's somewhat more efficient, but it's still using electricity to be self-propelled. And I just wonder about the measurement of these things. You're beyond the overshoot day, because that's kind of a very high level measure. And this might get into, I don't want to say should, but the latest question about, what makes sense for us to try to achieve? What are we measuring? Because we don't really know. It's hard to project, even though the UN does, what the population is going to be in 2050, because the UN thinks, for example, China is going to be a slightly bigger than it is now, not a whole lot, but some speaker, and this is all Nikki's fault, because some speaker Nikki had on said, I can't remember who we were talking about, said, well, if China in that time frame is probably going to be 800 or 700 million. I forget the number.
Pablo Jenkin, 700 million versus Africa is going to be 2.5 billion. He spoke about the blue zones. I don't know if you're familiar with the blue zones, Mathis, these 5 areas in the world where people go extremely old.
I guess I'm getting at is that, whatever that number is going to be, each individual needs to be, I would think, needs to be more cost effective, efficient in their use of resources. And I just wonder if there's a measure like that, without saying there should, just to say, hey, look, here's what, as a country, you have country Earth overshoot days, and as a large group, but people could say, well, I'm not having that problem. I recycle every week, but is there a measure, or is there some kind of system of measures that could be agreed upon, or has been agreed upon, that we could just use to keep track of progress? One of the reasons I like what you have talked about relative to, say, global warming is that's such a, it's like, okay, we can't do anything about that except complain. But Earth overshoot seems like getting closer to something we could actually do something about. So I know that was not really exactly a question, but a concept to throw out there, because I think if you had the measures, I think you could engage people more in that discussion, without the should, just in terms of the, how do we as a group get more efficient and effective?
Deep down, I'm a very boring engineer, and my wife complains about sometimes. I love numbers, so how do we put everything into numbers? And even though there's so much kind of data talk and like people kind of think, oh, it's so quantitative, often we forget to ask what's actually the question. What are the driving questions? What questions are super relevant to us? What does the CEO need to know in order to operate the enterprise more effectively? So answers that have no relevance to the decision making, or no clear, that seemingly don't have a clear relationship, they will not have much impact. Or people need to have the incentive to say, I want to know this information, I can make better decisions. And the worst is to think they actually will be curtailed in their opportunities by knowing that knowledge. So to me, just in the world of overshoot, understanding, this is going back to the question, as a CEO, I would want to know, if I doubled my company, would overshoot go up or down? That's super important to understand the value proposition of your company from a physical perspective. And so how would you measure that? You can go do that as well. But in the end, that's why we use the footprint, as we call it, pedestrian science, because we want to make it so simple. The principles are simpler than money accounting. Money accounting is actually quite complicated, because you have to distinguish between like revenue and profit is quite different, so is it like if you sell something, you also have to understand what's the cost to produce it, and then what the difference. So money accounting is more complex in some ways than resource accounting. We just go in the end, high school students could do it. You just look at how many potatoes do you consume, and you look at a field, how many potatoes can be grown on some level. There is a little bit more sophistication to that, but you need to standardize because not every hectare has the same productivity. So you kind of have to adjust for that. But in the end, you just map everything on how many percentage points of the global regeneration is being embodied by this particular activity. That's very straightforward. You could go into details. And the same thing you can do for a company. But then for the company, what does it mean? A company is just an artifact. So you have to basically say, by having a specific question that becomes measurable, because efficiency in itself is not measurable, because you have to say efficiency of what against what. But if you say, I think the question of saying, how would global overshoot change if your company doubled in exactly the same way it operates now? The same structure, or you have twice of your companies to make it.
Marco has a question, and I spotlighted him. Also, I'm asking the question for him because he's in the train. He said, okay. What chances for positive development and impact do you see behind the measures taken by the EU cutting Russia's gas and oil?
I wish I knew. I mean, there's the all path. In some ways, the shock forces us to take resource issues more seriously, and I think it gave us a bit of a shock to kind of recognize that actually it's a resource issue. It's not just climate change, and that fossil fuels like these issues. But what we see in the United States, like even Biden has gone back to fracking now, so kind of reinvesting into a, I think, outdated technology that in the end will not produce that much value. I'm very surprised by the German reaction to kind of reduce train costs and at the same time also gasoline costs. I'm not sure like how that links to the world we live in. And then I share our common confusion. Are we going to take advantage of this crisis or not? And particularly, I'm glad. It's that absurd. In Switzerland, just to take one example, the engineers just declare that burning waste is CO2 free, while in reality, the CO2 content of waste per kilowatt hour of waste is far higher than of coal. It'd be better just to burn coal and put the garbage into the coal mines, for example. So I'm just mentioning that in terms of kind of the confusion around natural gas. Natural gas, if you actually include the methane that can escape, it's not necessarily that much better than coal even. And we call it transition fuel. And so the propensity still to invest in quite obviously stranded assets, I find still staggering, and I can't fully explain. Because when I started, I think Marcus said, "Oh yeah, like everybody knows that," and that's why I'm trying to explain in ways that like not like, and still it doesn't link to our action in a way that say like, are we not committed to our own success? That's what I wonder. It looks like if we weren't, even though we say we are, but that's also the opportunity, because it's not that we're asking for Sisyphus work. We're saying, actually, there's a better way. It's going to be, we want to help preserve your wealth.
Joyce had a question. I don't know if you can put video on and spotlight you, but it's also okay like that.
I will need to drop right now, so I just wanted to let one comment actually, but then Mathis already mentioned it anyways, because I feel like we talk a lot about the consumer and like individual people, what they can do about it, but if the companies do not do something against it, it doesn't matter what you do as a consumer. Because if, for example, if we take usage of water, for example, it's not the consumer, it's not the individual person who is using it that much or taking so much from it. It's rather big industries of, I don't know, agriculture, or let's take fast fashion, all this kind of stuff. So it does matter what you do as an individual, but it will not have such a big impact if you as a company or if someone who is responsible for a company don't do something against it. That's what I wanted actually just to point out. But Mathis already came to that anyways. And I'm very sorry, I will need to drop now. Mathis, thank you for the discussion, and Nikki, thank you for the invitation.
Have a
And I
great
wish
spin.
you all a thank you.
Okay.
You'll be
Okay.
prepared for the bicycle future. That's good.
Yeah, I will. Okay, have a nice evening.
You too.
Bye.
Bye, Joyce.
Michi also posted a question. I'm going to spotlight her. How much do you see the climate debate for the consciousness for sustainability being displaced by threats such as inflation, declining real income, or corona?
Maybe that's a good thing. I don't know. I mean, I think it's helpful to look at the word from the perspective of overshoot as a big driver rather than splitting into climate change or these various aspects that in themselves evoke this tragedy of the commons of free rider problem. And if you think of overshoot, if we use more than what Earth can renew, there's an inevitable economic situation of stagflation in preparation, meaning the value of your assets that are not prepared for the future will dwindle, so you lose asset value. And the cost for getting your basic needs met increases because it's hard to get. So it's like burning the candle from both sides. Because somebody has to get the haircut. The question is who exactly will get the haircut. Some of that monetary policy can decide like whom to put the burden on more. But so the linkage between resource security, overshoot, and the economic outcomes is far stronger than people see. The way the story is told now, it's kind of the extra nice effort that particularly advanced countries are willing to do for the benefit of humanity. And that's the first thing that falls off, and more urgent and important crises emerge. That's a misconception. I'm putting it a bit crudely, but I think I read the newspaper every day, and that's kind of you can see that story every time. Like when I mean, Al Gore, thank you for bringing the attention of climate change to the world. At the same time, as if he closes his speech, that this is the greatest opportunity for humanity to live up to our moral potential. It sounds like a cost to those who are skeptical. It doesn't sound like people don't see the economic necessity. They say it's a noble pastime, or it's a noble thing. But why should I give up? If the world is actually in such a tight situation, giving up my privileges is even scarier, because not only will I lose my privileges, but in a difficult time. So the cognitive wheels in our brain go in the exact opposite direction, even though nobody dares to say that. I'm repeating myself, but I think that's really the crux of the matter, that the way we tell the story leaves people in a belief that there's no incentives for them to act, even though in reality, the real wealth generation of the world, it's actually the opposite is happening. So we are totally missing out on using the positive forces that could help the transformation by making people believe that there's no self-interest in acting. That's the tragedy. So the last press release of the Global Footprint Network will be this year's Earth Overshoot Day is December 31st. That basically would mean that you've done your job, because we've fixed the situation. We consume everything that the Earth can renew within a year. What is the action plan, or what would the Global Footprint Network need to get more attention and more focus towards that metric that change is actually happening? I mean, now I think, and that may be also an opportunity for collaboration. I believe we need to work, we as Global Footprint Network need to work far more aggressively with investors, and just show the case that, wow, this is not just an add-on. This really helps to build a portfolio that is far more robust. Envy is one of the best convincers.